I'm only gonna take like a couple of minutes and introduce our speaker today. We have Dr. Haas Dyson, and I have a story that I want to start with to tell about it, and she's going to die when I tell it, but I have to tell it because who else am I going to tell besides my friends here? So, as you all know, I'm moving to Arizona, and I took a job over there, and I met one of my colleagues at Arizona who happens to be a newer person, so she came up to my new office to meet me, and she comes up to me and says, I am so excited to meet you. I was looking forward to meeting you. And I was like, oh, awesome. And she said, because Ann Dyson is one of my personal heroes. And so I was like, oh, okay. I thought she was excited about meeting me, but she was excited about meeting Ann vicariously through me. So I just want to say that we have a superstar in our midst, and I'm very excited to introduce Ann. I know she doesn't like us to prattle on and on about all the things that she's done. She hates that. She just wanted me to introduce me as, here's Ann. But I did want to say that there's a lot of things that I've learned from Ann, and I know that I won't have a chance, I don't know when the next chance I'll have to say all of these blubbering things, so I thought I would say it now. I personally learned a lot of things from Dr. Dyson. I've learned how to do research. She's written a book called On the Case, and I think I've learned a lot about what it means to do ethically responsible research, to do it with integrity, but then to also do it well. And so I learned a lot from that book. I've learned a lot about how to respect language and culture and children's childhoods and their lives. She's written a lot of books about that. Brothers and Sisters Learn to Write, which is about popular literacies. Social Worlds of Children, which talks about their relationships with each other and how they use that in their writing. I know all of our personal favorites, Writing Superheroes, where she really has a very deep understanding of just children and their interests and the things that they come to school with. One of her recent books that she wrote with her dear friend, Dr. Ganeshi, is Children, Language, and Literacy, Diverse Learners in Diverse Times, and I think it's a great relevant book about just how the politics and the situations surrounding our times and what that means for children and their cultural childhoods and all of that. So I think one of the things that she's done for me personally is I think I remember my first day in graduate school and how overwhelmed I felt, and I think I learned that I can actually read things that I thought were impossibly hard to read, and I think she's taught me to believe in myself in that. I'm able to write things that I never thought I would be able to write because of her guidance. I can talk about things that I never thought that I would be able to talk about that seem like a foreign language to me. And so I think from all of that, I can deduce that she really is a fantastic teacher. And so I think for myself, it's really taught me how to be a better teacher, not only to children, but to other people and the people that I encounter and be with. So there's a lot of things I'm gonna miss about her. Obviously, from what I talked about, her generosity and spirit. I'm also gonna miss Diet Cokes and popcorn. I'm gonna miss her, very enthusiastic, holy hex. And I'm gonna miss all of her wonderful scarves that are so beautiful that she wears every day, and I always go to class looking forward to seeing what scarf she's gonna wear today. So without further ado, here's Dr. Dyson.
I should quit while I'm ahead. But it's very lovely to be here with all of you dedicated teachers who have come together for this week of reflection and renewal, and I'll see if I can contribute to that in some way. So I am going to talk about ethics. The ethics that are embedded in the writing programs designed for our kids, and the ethics that operate in children's worlds during writing time, and they aren't exactly the same thing. So I hope that that will be material for reflection for you. And I'm going to start with an excerpt from an essay by Pablo Neruda. And in this essay, he recalls a childhood event that, for him, captured the essence of what it meant to be a writer. So he said, he's writing about when he was a little boy. He says, one time in the backyard of our house in Temuco, I came upon a hole in one of the boards of the fence. All of a sudden, a hand appeared, a tiny hand of a boy about my own age. By the time I came close, the hand was gone, and in its place was this marvelous toy sheep. Well, I went into the house and I brought out a treasure of my own, a pine cone, open, full of resin and odor, which I adored. I set it down in the same spot, and then I went off with the sheep. He went back later, when the pine cone was gone, but he never did meet that boy. Never did meet that boy. There was no sign of him. So a never-to-be-known child on the other side of the fence made an offering, and Neruda felt compelled to respond. He shared a corner of this precarious planet with an unseen other, and he felt obligated to respond to him. So this exchange of a toy sheep and a pine cone became for him a metaphor for the poems he would push through publishers' fences to unknown others with whom he felt a shared humanity. Now, I think this metaphor, this idea of an exchange, works also for writing. And when we think about little children, it's going to work in a very literal way. Writing is a response to others with whom we share some actual or virtual space. People who study the development of young children and compare it to the development of the young of other species say that one of the things that defines us as human beings, maybe the thing that defines us most as human beings, is that we are given to this social responsiveness. That's something that seems a biological gift we have. But this biological gift is shaped by cultural norms and social institutions like schools. So when we teach children to write, we are also teaching them ethics. We're teaching them how they are to communicate with, how they are to respond to, how they are to offer their words to other people. Now, to make things even more interesting, children are learning these ethics not only from their teachers, but of course from the people most important to little children, who tend to be other children. I know that hurts your feelings, but it's true. Now imagine, for example, bless you, writing time in Mrs. B's kindergarten in a low-income neighborhood serving mainly children of color. Now all the way through, those are the schools I'll be talking the most about. Over the last 40 years, those are the schools I have worked in as a teacher and I have written about as a researcher, because I think these are the schools where we tend to talk about children as having disadvantages, and we tend not to talk about them as having resources. And I am interested in highlighting the resources of children, particularly the resources of children as children. So imagine this scene. Now, Mrs. B has worked all year long to teach her children to write, just as she is directed to in her mandated curricular guidebooks for writing. I don't know if you're familiar with those mandated curricular guidebooks for writing, but Mrs. B was familiar with those mandated curricular guidebooks, and someone came around during the time I was in her room to make sure she was familiar with those mandated curricular guidebooks. Now, in these guidebooks, the children were to express themselves as individuals, crafting their own true experiences on paper, and that is a tough word, true. We'll come back to that. They are not to climb into other people's true stories, and they're not to take other people's true stories for their own. Mrs. B, though, has not been entirely successful at preventing this. Now, on this May Day, I'm the kid's adult friend, I'm an observer in the room, and I'm sitting by 5-year-old Jamal, and Coretta comes over to our table. She wants me to read her story. Now, on the first page of that story, you can see that there's a car in its front. It's in front of a big building with 2 double doors. And on the second page, now you have to ignore, I miss the old overhead sometimes, because go over there, Haney, would you? Put your finger over the kid with the short hair. The first one. Yeah, oh, you can't. Oh, she's so short. Here. I know, Haney, take a book. Take a book. Take a book and cover him up. There, perfect, yay. Okay. She just had those 3 girls standing there. You can tell that, there's this notion that you're supposed to make just a quick sketch, and then, right, it's okay, you're going to kill yourself, but that's okay, I really appreciate that. They got the idea now. Okay, so these are stick figure girls. They've got this chin-length curved hair. They're just supposed to, I know you're familiar with this, make a quick sketch. As an aside, I've always had to giggle. You go into a kindergarten, and the kids are making people with circles and appendages coming out, and then you're supposed to say, just a quick sketch. And I'm thinking, who writes these things? Just a quick sketch, a tadpole person, just a quick sketch. I don't know, we've lost common sense. But at any rate, there are no high heels. There's no elaborate dresses. These are just stick figures. And she's written about liking to go to the mall and about her plan to take her friends to the mall with her. So Jamal's sitting there and he says, well, what about me? I'm your friend. Moreover, he continues, he is the one driving the car to the mall, for real. So how are you going to get to the mall? I'm the one who drives the car. So Coretta, who is standing, she leans over, she puts her paper on the table, and in full view of Jamal, she now adds that other stick figure that Haney so valiantly covered up, the one with no hair hanging down, just a line across the top of his head. That's how the kids distinguish gender. Hair down, hair across the top of the head. What's funny is that Jamal, in truth, had dreadlocks. But that is not how we draw boys. We draw boys with just this short line across the top of the head. Oh, you're going to add him, I say, quite interested in the turn of events. I have to, said Coretta. I have to add him, said Coretta, but in the official world, she didn't have to. Mrs. B was not telling her to fix her piece. Jamal was. I have to, said Coretta, but she didn't have to. She could have responded by positioning herself as a good student. She could have said, you make your story how you want it, I make my story how I want it. But she did not say that. She could have responded as a girl. She could have said, it's just us girls going to the mall, no boys. But she did not. Coretta made a choice as an individual who felt obligated to respond to a friend, and Jamal was her friend. Coretta was playing. She was playing on paper. She was pretending to go to the mall, and Jamal wanted to play too, so she let him. The story is longer, and Jamal is on every page of the story. She added him in. She had to. She had to. Jamal and Coretta bring us deep into the ethics of the children's world. The children I have observed in this project and many others did not act as isolated individuals, but they had responsibilities to each other. If Coretta was to be a good friend in an ethical sense, she had to respond to Jamal. Jamal had every right to expect to be included in that trip to the mall because she was going with her friends, and he said, aren't I your friend? You know, what's wrong with you, Brutus? In the view of the philosopher Kwame Appiah, ethics has to do with what we should do as an individual because we share communities, we share identities with other people. We feel a sense of obligation and of purpose through our membership in communities. They could be large ethnic ones, they could be smaller ones involving family or friends, and they can be classroom ones. In a similar way, the language philosopher Bakhtin views our ethics as enacted through our responsiveness to other people. Am I a friend? Said Jamal. If so, I should get to play on your paper too. So I want to talk about ethics, the ethics that govern official writing programs for young children and those enacted in the unofficial world of or peer lives of children themselves. So I'm going to ask, in the official world, I think I've got these written out. I'm going to ask, in the official world, what is a good child expected to do during writing, or more accurately, who are they expected to be? Now it says what ideologies. Ideologies just means values and beliefs. What beliefs about language, what beliefs about what written language is, what beliefs about childhood undergird these expectations? And then I'm going to ask the same thing about unofficial worlds, because children have expectations for what they regard as good behavior too. Expectations that are not necessarily the same as those of the official world. So I'm going to illustrate this ethical gap. And I'm going to concentrate on Mrs. B's kindergarten, not because that's the only place where it operates, but because kindergartners are so raw to school. So a lot of their expectations and the way they bump against the official school world are particularly visible. Now, there was a second project that I'll refer to as I go along that went along with this. It was a first grade in another school district taught by Mrs. K, also serving children who were labeled at risk of school failure just by their very existence because of family income, minority status, or home language other than the local quote, standard, unquote, English. Now, the writing program in both schools blended an emphasis on conventional basics, like knowing letter names and sounds, in Mrs. K's room using standard grammar, which I found amusing, with an emphasis on the writing process and the production of real-life stories, to quote Mrs. K. Now, I don't know where this idea that young children find easiest real stories came from. It started about 40 years ago when I was just starting to teach myself. There's no research basis for it. It's just a rumor somebody started. And now it's all over the place. And it causes problems. The idea that every single child is going to take the same path into writing, every single child is going to find it easiest to draw on a personal experience is a problematic assumption, and I'm going to show you that. Now, to understand this potential ethical gap, we have to remember what we know as teachers, that a classroom is not a singular place. Its times and spaces are made meaningful through official and unofficial values and beliefs. Both teachers and children respond to the other based at their best at a sense of responsibility. Now, children are students in the official world, and we do want them to have a sense of responsibility to respond to their teacher. But they're also peers, and they have responsibilities to each other. And some of them from tight neighborhoods are also cousins. They're next door neighbors. They share the bus. They're not going to ignore each other. That just would be, that would not be wise. That would not be wise. They have to go home. That would not be a good idea. In fact, in Mrs. B's room, 2 extended families made up the majority of the children in the room. Everybody was somebody's cousin. So they have a sense of they had a sense of responsibility to each other, although Mrs. K's room was quite different, but I saw a very similar kind of phenomenon. Now, in order to figure out these ethics, I'll show you what I did. Let's skip that. So I studied the official curricular documents, trying to figure out what was it that they expected of kids and what did they expect of written language. But the most important thing was I studied the notes I took in their rooms over the course of at least 1 academic year. And I looked at 2 things. One is the nature of teachers and children's corrections of each other's behavior. So when teachers say something like, okay, now that's not what you're supposed to be doing. That's what we say, right? Something like that. Is that what you're supposed to be doing? It's just a rhetorical question, right? It means you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. But when children say it to each other, they say something like, that's not nice, or you're mean, or unfair, or the absolute worst, you're not coming to my party. Even if they never have a birthday party, it's just all a fiction, they still say that, you're not coming to my birthday. You know, that is the pits. Not coming to my birthday. Now, the other thing I looked at was something that at first may throw you for a loop, but I can explain it. This idea of participation modes, or the way members organize their interaction with each other. And I need to explain that idea because ethical obligations and social organization are linked. So the way we're organized right now is I'm standing up here and you are all out there, and if you started talking loudly to each other, I would think, oh gosh, what a bunch of rude people, and I would get my feelings hurt, and I would think, is that what you're supposed to be doing? But I wouldn't say that because you're supposed to. Because, you just can't say it. There's things you can say. Listen, Haney, this is a bit of advice. There are things you can say to children that you cannot say to adults. You cannot say, put your hands on your head, put your hands on your ears, put your hand in your mouth. In 1975, I'm just rambling because I'm so tired. In 1975, but this might be helpful for Haney, I taught my first university class, and the students were not listening to me. They were not listening to me. So just out of habit, I said, put your hands on your head, put your hands on your ears, put your hands on your mouth. Okay, like what I was trying to say was, and then, during the break, I went into the restroom, and, the women's restroom, everybody's in stalls. So I went into a stall, and I heard the students come in and say, can you believe her? Put your hand on our head. What are we, 6? And I was thinking, yes, you're 6. You're just like a 6. Anyway, I improved. So at any rate, now let's say instead of being organized like we are now, we were organized in small groups and you had a task. Then if people didn't start talking to each other, that would be judged differently, right? That would be, oh, these people are uncooperative, they're rude to each other, they can't even bother to acknowledge each other's existence. That wouldn't be good. Or let's say, just to strike terror, I put you all in little cubicles, or I had you make one, the way the kids do, put your book so you make a little cubicle for yourself, and then I'm going to give you an essay question about what I said so far, which you might think, oh dear, that made no sense so far. And then, so you might whisper to each other, what does she want? What are you putting? And if I saw that, I might say, no cheating. So the ethics are different, right? It depends. Now, the essence of the ethics gap relates to that. In the official world, as I'll elaborate, children are to respond to their teacher's instruction by writing their individual truth. And it's like they are all in cubicles. It's like they are in cubicles. So issues arise of truth and ownership. Now, unofficially, like Coretta and Jamal were doing, the children often organize themselves playfully. It's like they have a textual playground that they're playing together. So their ethics are different. They're about inclusion, exclusion, appropriate representation. No, you may not blow me up in your paper. So children cross-culturally are drawn to other children and to playful relationships. And sometimes, I think, these mandated scripted curricula we're getting are very uncomfortable with children as children. The difficulty with teaching pre-K and elementary school is that the students act like little children. They're just so childish. Can you believe it? This, I suggest, this is the problem. This is one problem with those programs. So this is particularly problematic for children that are viewed as other. Children whose textual, social, and cultural resources and motivations are on display when they have some agency, including in play. So I want to elaborate on this idea and then tell you what I think it all means. Now, the last two times I gave this talk, I ran out of time right when I was going to tell you what it all means, so that may be up to you. But at least I'll clarify this gap and try to say things along the way that might be useful. So first we're going to look at the place of the child self in the official writing curriculum. Now, throughout the world, learning to write is most often a matter of learning what are considered the basics. And the basics, unfortunately, does not begin with responsiveness, but with basic conventions of letter forms, spelling, and sentence structure. Now, even in situations where children are given time to compose with drawing and writing, uniform, mandated lessons kind of squeeze children's intentions out of the curriculum. And as I said, Mrs. B had a mandated scripted writing program. She had never taught kindergarten before, and she felt under a lot of pressure to have the kids meet the benchmarks that were associated with that program. Now, in such a curricula, the dominant ideology or the value and belief about child selves is what Appia calls a particularly unattractive version of individualism. In this ideology, individuality is over here, sociability is over here, and they're competing goals. You have to apply yourself, you have to do your work, you have to not play around with your seatmates. The good child becomes a successful child who moves to the head of the class by paying attention, by concentrating on his or her work, and thereby mastering the grammatical and orthographic rules of writing conventions. And the relationships among the children are hierarchical. Some kids are better than others, which is not necessarily how they organize themselves. But that's what the upshot of that is. Now, in mandated writing process or workshop approaches for early schooling, young children are not only supposed to learn the rules, but they're supposed to learn to express themselves. The good child thinks and then selects a potential topic from the repertoire of real experiences. There may be times when children are to share their plans with each other or provide editorial critique to a partner. But those are all mandated. They do this when they're told to do this. The ultimate goal is for the individual to quite literally produce texts and thereby selves in which, to quote Appia, you matter most. You, the author, you are the most important person. Unfortunately, I think it leads to a lot of texts like, I got to do this and this and this and this, and I went here and there, and you poor thing didn't get to. Years and years ago, I was in a room where the teacher, it was a wonderful teacher, but there was a great division in social class in this room, and some little kids would stand up and read a text about how they went on an airplane. I was in California then, how they went in an airplane and they went to such and such a state, and they went here and there and other place. And I was sitting next to this one little kid who said to me, I bounced a ball and that was it. I mean, what exactly is that child learning? I bounced a ball and that was pretty much it. So part of being taught writing is, again, being taught the rights and obligations children have as students and as writers. So now we're going to concentrate then on this official writing curriculum in action. Now, I know that the dilemmas and the tensions that Mrs. B faced are faced by many of us. If we chuckle, we're not chuckling at the teacher, we're chuckling at the situation because it's that laugh or cry. I know teachers like Mrs. B who are gracious and courageous enough and want me to come in and see what's happening are a gift to us all. Because I know when I've shared experiences along the way in my own classes, teachers always say, oh yeah, that happened to me too. So that's the spirit in which I'm showing these. I'm just picking out certain incidents that I think will make my point. So the first idea is that in the official curriculum, I want a real story about you. I don't want you to read the text ahead of time, but it's a real story about you and the you that is not Spider-Man. Now, given that curriculum, when the teacher observed her children, she saw two interrelated ethical issues. They took each other's ideas and hers too, and they didn't tell their own truths. This is kindergarten. I'm there the first week of school. It's an issue almost immediately. For example, Mrs. B, very early in the school year, modeled a personal story about having gone skiing. She's a marvelous storyteller, so she acted out her narrative. She's drudging up an imagined hill. She's got her skis, and then she's coming down, and then, oops, she falls right on her bottom. The children love this. Anything with bottom they like. So they laughed at this story. They seemed to love it. And when they went to their work tables, many children told very similar stories or drew pictures of it, even though nobody had ever been skiing. So this was a problem. And Mrs. B is trying to nip this in the bud. She said, a lot of you copied my story. That's not good. That's illegal. She's desperate. You can't, this has been going on. She says, well, now what? This is not what the book says. You can't copy my story. You have to have your own story, your own thoughts, your own idea. I know there are many things that you guys like to do and many things that you guys have already done. So Mrs. B was approaching her children as individuals with ethical obligations as writers. Writers are not to take other people's stories. That ethical problem of taking what is not yours is connected to this other problem of truth, because we got this thing about true stories. These poor people are hot. I don't know what to do. Okay, and now I lost my place. Okay, a good writer draws on their true selves, their true experiences, and you express your true self on paper. Now, contributing to these ethical violations were children's shared attractions to characters and plot lines from popular media. SpongeBob, Hannah Montana, and Spider-Man. Now, I hate to tell you people this, but they're not real. Still, they were a real part of children's everyday lives. They watched them on the television, they talked about them, they liked drawing them in the midst of one adventure or another, but this posed a problem. Now, it's not unusual, unfortunately, for children's interest in popular media to be dismissed in school. Children's use of media resources can be seen as vulgar, as violent, or crass consumerism. But from the point of view of the writing program, the problem was truth. Children could write about wanting to see a Superman movie. They could write about getting a Spider-Man toy or game for a birthday present, or even about wanting such a toy from Santa Claus. In other words, commercialism was okay. And Santa Claus's commercialism is okay too. Now, I don't know if anybody ever told you, but Santa Claus is not real either. But nobody ever questioned Santa Claus. Now, what was not okay was entering into an imagined world in which the child could become Spider-Man or some other awesome figure. Children could not fly through the air on a textual playground. Now, this is another excerpt from early in the school year, and Mrs. B is explaining the situation to her children. Eventually, Mrs. B is going to abandon this curriculum, but she's giving it her all now. She says, I don't want you dreaming up something about Superman, Batman, and all those folk, because they're not really real. You can't say anything about Spider-Man, because you don't know who that is. I do, say the children. No, you don't, said Mrs. B. Say the children. Do you know the real Spider-Man? Yes, say the children. No, you don't, said Mrs. B, because Spider-Man is not a real person. He's just a character. After Mrs. B is finished, she explains about movies and strings hanging down and people flying through the air. I wonder if she watched the Tony Awards. The children talked among themselves about Spider-Man. Want me to tell you where Spider-Man work at? Cece asked her table mates. My mama said Pizza Hut. Spider-Man works at Pizza Hut. You might want to check that out. Now, soon the children begin their composing, and once again the ethical problems of truth and illegal copying arise again. Now, as will be seen, when the spotlight moves to unofficial worlds and their participation modes. Now, before I move to the children's world, I want to talk about this potential problem with truth. The notion of being truthful and its link to valuing one's real life is highly problematic. In part, this is because cross-culturally, it doesn't matter where on the globe you go, a major aspect of children's real life is pretend play. This is how they imagine themselves into a larger world. This is how they learn to imagine other possibilities. It's basic to critical inquiry, to critical literacy. This is how they develop language. They appropriate language, they improvise on it in situations they themselves have had no opportunity for. In addition, a story worth telling may be one that dramatizes an experiential germ of a story and then transforms it into an engaging, if not literally true one. Performative storytelling involving exaggerated plot action is not confined to any one categorized cultural group. Still, a performative telling of a, quote, true story, unquote, that is definitely not true is one aspect of the African American storytelling heritage, and African American kids dominated in Mrs. B's room. Now, in such a story, the teller emphasizes an encounter with social or physical adversity. And the stories are often amusing, and these kids knew how to tell good stories. Finally, one might ask, is writing about going inside the self in search of some inner authenticity? Or is it, as Bakhtin argued, about the self as articulated in response to the other and the experienced world? That's why I write. Other people write. I don't agree with them, and I want to have my say. That's why I do it. This philosopher I like so much, a dead Russian, there's a lot of dead Russians in graduate school, some of you already know that, and this one, Bakhtin, is not as dead as other ones like Vygotsky, but he's no longer with us. And he said that we compose ourselves as we respond to the other. You think about all, I think that's why you learn so much as a teacher. There are these endless variations of children. So you respond to them, and don't you sometimes when you're responding to them, you discover new aspects of yourself that you didn't know you had, or experiences you didn't remember, skills long since buried. The self is a gift of the other. That's how I think about writing, and this notion of responsiveness is very key to the children's world. I don't want to idolize it. They are our children. They have our hang-ups. But the essence of it, the essence of what's going on is social relationships. Now, I tried to say two things at once. Children's relationships with each other can be organized in what are called child cultures in school. By child cultures, I mean the shared practices that children develop together in response to the world around them. Now, when I watch them play on textual playgrounds, they're certainly taking advantage of what they learned in the official world. There would be no play without the official lessons. They use resources like the writing tools. The reason they've got all these seatmates is because they're in school. And they do, in the way it makes sense to them, take advantage of the lessons they've had on writing skills. But unofficial worlds also take advantage of unofficial resources, like their shared knowledge of media figures and local pleasures. That's why it's hard to stamp out Spider-Man. They like Spider-Man. They know local swimming pools. They know the shopping malls if they get to go. They know the playgrounds in the neighborhood. And they also have shared social practices, and the two I want to emphasize are storytelling and pretend play. So these shared practices provide a context for their own entry into writing. So if we think of writing as this social activity, the ethics that become salient are not about the unencumbered self. They're about the responsive self. And again, these issues of inclusion and reciprocity matter. So let's go into the children's world, and first we're going to start with this Me Too, collegiality in writing. Now I want to say there were lots of ways that children, if I look across Mrs. B into Mrs. K's room, there were lots of ways that the children organized themselves in writing time. There was this one I'm going to emphasize, which is collegiality and responsiveness to what each other are doing. But there was also a deliberate effort to coordinate their actions, like, hey, let's all write about whatever. There was complementary actions in which children take different social roles in a kind of play on paper. There was big birthday party play in Mrs. K's room. Nobody in Mrs. K's room ever had a birthday party. It didn't matter. The fun was planning a birthday party, making your list, and saying who was coming, and having other kids beg you to come. After the big day came, if I asked about it, the kids would say, my mommy didn't let me have one. And then on to the next, who cares? It was just, who cares? It's the planning of it that was so much fun. So if I, as author, invite you to my pretend party, then you, as author, are supposed to write that you are coming to my pretend party. That's what they did. Now, another kind of social organization is something I call collaborative improvisation, in which children write ongoing in response to what the other child is writing ongoing. This is more sophisticated. I saw it in the first grade. There was a game called the Pine Cone Wars. It started out on the playground. This playground had a lot of pine trees, and although they were not supposed to do it, they used pine cones, not as a lovely little poetic gifts like Pablo Neruda, but as projectiles during war. You're not supposed to do that, but they did it. So pretty soon they're in the classroom, and they're having these battles, and Lerone is battling Manny, and Manny is battling Lerone, and they're going back and forth about whose team is going to destroy whose army. And a little girl, Tiana, says, "Can I play?" This is during writing. She literally says, "Can I play?" And they say, "We only play with men." Okay, she's really, really mad now. She's really mad. So she starts writing, and she's writing about the tough girls, T-O-F-E, tough girls. We are tough girls, and we're going after the boys. So whatever they did, she did more. And pretty soon, there was the most writing they ever did. Unfortunately, it was kind of violent, but it was very engaging. Now, I'm going to start with the most pervasive and the not as sophisticated, just this collegiality. Now, in the world apart from writing, collegiality was on display when children had rounds of oral storytelling. As people do across cultures, one storyteller engenders other stories, right? You do that. Somebody tells a story, then you say, oh yeah, something like that happened to me, and then you tell your own story, and somebody else tells their own story. Now, these are the kindergartners doing this orally, and then I'll show you them doing it in writing. Where does the time go? So, kindergartners Alicia, Odette, and Della are coloring a picture as part of a reading activity. The picture says, "A cat scared of a bat." It's one of those linguistic readers, bat, cat, fat. But bats make Odette think of birds. And Odette says, "Guess what? In preschool, there were some birds in the lunchroom. I seen some birds on my food, and they go beep, beep, beep." "Well, guess what?" says Della. "I seen some birds in a store." "Oh, my goodness," says Odette. "Well, me too," says Alicia, who never went to preschool. But she's looking at Odette and saying, I saw birds in lunchroom in my preschool. In my imagination, she doesn't say that part. "They were way up on the ceiling, beep, peep, peep, and they came flying down. I tried to catch it, but it flew back up." Now this appeals to Odette, so she says, "And then I was starting to fly, and I flied up and I tried to catch a bird." And they're off and running. They're having a very good time. Peeping birds in schools and stores, flying birds and a flying child. This is what we do. This is how we build community, and we also build language while we're at it. Now, during writing time, this is very familiar to the children. They do this. So during writing, this oral responsiveness blended with graphic responsiveness. So asked to draw and write a real story, the children didn't necessarily have a topic, but they had a conversation and a play with ideas. So in the kindergarten, Such an episode immediately followed Mrs. B's caution about not writing about flying superheroes. And then they had just had this about, well, if you want to see a flying superhero, go to Pizza Hut. So it was the same kids. And then, so it was Cece and Latrell. So now I'll tell you how this came about. How this came about. Latrell says, they're talking about flying things, and Latrell says, I seen a balloon when I went on I seen an air balloon, says Cece. It was up in the sky. It was the color blue, says Latrell. Yeah, it went all the way up in the sky. It was over by my daycare, says Cece. Miss B, we seen the air balloon. Me too, said Della. I saw the air balloon. As Me Too's arise, everybody saw an air balloon. Mrs. B comments, everybody didn't see an air balloon now. Only the things you really did see. Nonetheless, all around the room, air balloons are popping up. Soon, one of Latrell's air balloons sprouts petals. You can see this one down in the left-hand corner, and it becomes a flower. And then another air balloon, the one above that, grows appendages, and this is him flying through the air. He's flying through the air, but he's not a superhero. He was propelled by his mother. He says, this is how I went up in the sky when I was a baby. My mommy threw me up in the sky. I couldn't come down. I didn't know I could fly. A robot catched me. And that balloon over there turned out kind of funny, so he made it a robot. And that robot is going to save him from crashing to the earth. In the end, the children at Latrell's table all drew air balloons because they had seen them, or maybe they wanted to see them. And Latrell, whose products were fluid, moved from a flying air balloon to flying through the air, saved by a conveniently located robot. This was a true account of what was happening on his paper, but probably not a true account of what was happening in his life. In a very similar way, children exchanged varied kinds of stories while they were riding, including, my favorites were getting bitten by sharks in the pool and even the bathtub. I tell you, you gotta watch those sharks in Champaign County. You don't know where they're gonna show up. Now, officially, if papers ended with the same idea, one could say, okay, the kids copied. But you could also say that the children did not copy in the official sense. They conversed, and that conversing shaped their composing. So conversational storytelling was a very common social practice in children's worlds. It was a resource. It could contextualize and guide children's entry into official composing. Now, this is very early in the year, but later on, I can imagine that they'd want to write balloons, and they'd be talking among themselves, how do you write balloons? So they will have each other and a common topic, a common textual playground in which to venture forth together. Now, another very basic participation mode, one strongly linked to ethical issues of reciprocity, was this complementary relations, and I want to show you one of those. What about me? Well, it's related to that what about me story. Complementary relations like collegial ones are very common in childhood, especially in dramatic play. One child does something and the other is supposed to respond. In its most sophisticated form, one child takes a social role, is the mother, and then somebody else has to take a related social role, be the baby. Someone's going to be the good guy, somebody's going to be the bad guy. That they know how to do this. Now, in nascent form, during writing, these relations could involve only one child, author, and an aggrieved other. That's what happened with Jamal and Coretta, right? He wasn't actually writing in response to her. But in its most sophisticated form, texts were complementary. They were reciprocally related. So there's no way you could understand writing by looking only at one child's paper. You had to see that paper in relationship to other papers. So again, I'm going to take an event from very early in the school year to explain this. This is Alicia's Mermaids. You can sort of see down the bottom, it says mermaids. You got to have a little, she just didn't have enough letters, she added more, but you can see at the beginning, mermaid, and then how about a PGOF? Okay. Now, Alicia knew about playing together on paper. She had played previously a great deal with Willow, so she was quite put out when Jamal did not respond appropriately from her point of view. So Jamal, Alicia, and others at the work table have been drawing and talking about mermaids. And Jamal has made it clear that on his paper, I am a mermaid, but I'm not a girl mermaid. So Alicia has made a row of mermaids, and one she announces to the table is Jamal. Alicia tells Jamal that now you can see the J. See the shorter mermaid with a J on it? Who's got that little thing? Oh, you do. See, can you do the little J? There's the J. Oh, no, that's the mermaid. That's the J. Yep, that's Alicia up there staring at the mermaids. So Alicia tells Jamal that now he needs to put her and her name in his picture, but he does not. Alicia tries to show him how to write her name on his paper. So she takes his paper and she starts making a name, and he grabs his paper back. Alicia complains loudly that Jamal don't want me in his picture. So you know clearly, this is a violation. I did it for him, now he's supposed to do it for me, but he is not moved. He has a complaint of his own. Alicia has misrepresented his identity. He is a boy mermaid, but all of Alicia's mermaids look the same. Like her usual, this is how she drew people, usually not flat like this, but upright. So this was an innovation. Usually they're upright. They have these, at this point in the year, they have long rectangular bodies, and they have these appendages sticking out, and little circles at the top that are heads. They're not as long as this, but that's how her people tend to look. Now the one that's Jamal actually has more of a triangle than a rectangle. I think it's because she made the heads so small and tried to make it smaller because it's supposed to be Jamal. But Jamal says to her, "Hey, you got me in a dress." No, I didn't, says Alicia. "I do have a dress. That's me," he points to himself, and he says, "and you gave me a dress." This is not a dress. That's boys' pants. Boys have pants with ties. "It's a dress," says Jamal. You know, he's very mad. Now, what's interesting is after this encounter, Alicia abruptly changed her way of making people. Look at this. They're stick figures. No more long bodies that look like dresses. And when she needed to differentiate gender, can you tell which one is Jamal? Yeah, the line across the top. And of course, they're all in the car, KR. They're all in the car going on a trip together. You have to see the whole, you can't just look at the writing, right? You have to look at the whole thing. They're off together. So Alicia's objection, this, by the way, this would be, in my mind, a cultural practice in this classroom, how you indicate gender. That's the appropriate way to do it. The other way clearly did not fly with Jamal. Alicia's objection, grounded in a sense of reciprocal obligation for inclusion, led Jamal to an objection of his own, how she had misrepresented him. The children's encounter revealed tensions in their ongoing social event and, moreover, an ideological positioning. The child declaring the self as a boy mermaid. He's a boy mermaid. He's very sensitive about that. He's sensitive about how he's going to be depicted, because all along he's been saying, "I'm a boy. I'm a mermaid, but I'm a boy." They're just 5. The maid thing just doesn't throw him for a loop, you know. In such ways, children learn the cultural act of, I want to say that this tension led to more deliberate use of symbolic stuff, right? Alicia changed her way of drawing people. In such ways, children learn the cultural act of writing, of participating in the social and intellectual life around them through multimodal composing. But there was nothing in the curriculum to suggest that children's use of written language is in any way connected to their relationships with other children. In fact, the blanket admonition against copying could lead children to adopt a competitive rather than a communicative stance toward writing at each other. Now, I'm just about out of time, so I'm going to go really fast, but I don't want to skip this. If I had another, it's not on here. Oh Oh no, I don't want you to look at Odette yet. Imagine, you have to use your imagination. Imagine there's another slide and it says copying on it. Now, you know, if you copy somebody else's ideas, that is plagiarism. But if we're writing together, that's not plagiarism, right? It's something else. It's something else. So in the beginning of the year, when Mrs. B would talk about copying, the children seemed as if they really didn't, they didn't attend to this. They didn't seem to get this at all. When Alicia told Latrell that Ernest had copied his snowman, Latrell said, so what? No big deal. Make a snowman, you know? By mid-year, though, copying was widely viewed as an accusation, but only if it took place outside of a relationship. And I think that's interesting because children do use that I mean, you hear children say that, right? You're copying us. We're starting to do this now, you're copying us. So on the textual playground, they do the same thing. Listen to this. One day, kindergartners Tia, Charisse, and Monique had been doing shame, shame, shame. You know that song? Shame, shame, shame. Now, if you're in the Bay Area of California, you go, I don't want to go to Macy's no more, more, more. There's a big fat policeman. If you're in Illinois, Champaign, Illinois, I think Macy's is a late comer, so you don't do that. You know what they do? I don't want to go where? Mexico, no, more, more, more. There's also a big fat policeman at the door, door, door. So, you know, what's the difference? So they're going to do this shame, shame, shame. And Charisse comes up with the idea. This would be my coordinating, you know, I love those. I'm getting fast out of time, but I love this whole thing with hand clap games. I think they're fascinating. They go back hundreds of years, and I wish the kids had more time to play and we could learn more. But this day, Tia, Charisse, and Monique are going to organize themselves in what I call a coordinating participation mode. They're all going to do the same thing. So Charisse comes up with the idea that, hey, let's write about, let's do shame on their paper. Monique says, yeah, that's what we can do. And Charisse says, come on, let's get to work. Let's write shame, shame, shame. So they work out the spelling, and finally Tia says with great joy, this is fun. This is fun. Because, you know, they can stop every once in a while and do as much as they've written. They really like it. But when the girls thought Vashon, a boy, was going to write shame too, Monique was quick to react. You can't write about it because you're copying us. Not you copying me. You copying us. It was outside a relationship. Now, near the end of the year, the children did sometimes appropriate the general rule against copying, but then it became a kind of competition. It's like, you know, out on the playground, if somebody gets a ball first, then that's the argument, right? I had it first. Whoever got it first. If it's public property, whoever grabs it first gets it for that time. And that was the same principle operating in writing. I realize I'm running out of time. I'm just going to do this and show Odette, and then I'll say thank you very much, and I'll leave, don't worry. So one day in May, it's the end of the year, the kindergartners were to write their plans for the summer. The children at Latrell's table had very similar plans. Latrell began writing and orally monitoring, I go to the park. And Cece also began a sentence about playing at the park. Me too, y'all, said Precious. I like to play at the park. Now, in the background, Mrs. B could be heard telling children at another table not to copy off of anybody's paper. So Latrell says, and Precious, you can't write that because I said that. Well, I said I like to play at the park, said Cece in a matter-of-fact voice. Actually, piped up Ernest, I'm going to write, I'm going to the park. They all wrote about going to the park. No one copied anyone. It's just they all planned to be spending their summer at the park and at the pool. Ironically, when the children appropriated the ethical rules of the official world, when they tried to have their own individual truth as it was defined by the school, their texts were the least unique. Their inexperience as writers and their emerging understanding of curricular demands for realness reduce these beautifully elaborate stories into simple statements of liking this or that or going here or there. This was especially so for Luttrell, who really wanted to be good. He wanted to be good. He wanted his mama to be proud of him. And the more he understood about what good writers did, the less individual his text could become. So Luttrell, the little boy who imagined monsters and flying through the air as a baby, became just another kid swinging at the park. Now, I have Odette here because there were some kids who remained pretty impervious to this idea that would eliminate all the fiction in our lives where we find so many truths. And that was Odette. And that's where this came about. She wrote about going to the park too, but look at the last page. Then we fly home. And I said to her, well, Odette, how do you fly home? She said, with our hair. I just love that. We fly home with our hair. You know, if I were the teacher, I'm afraid I would just go nuts at that. I would have to read it out loud. And I'd think about all those little kids with the crew cuts and how were they going to fly home and what fun we would have. And look at that den, isn't that interesting? She speaks African American vernacular English, so TH in the phonological rules of the system can be pronounced D. And what a marvelous opportunity. This is another talk, but also the curriculum doesn't do anything about language variation. To think about how we say words in different ways, but we spell them the same, except if we're trying to represent people's voices in certain kinds of stories, right? So I think that's not over these kids' heads by the end of the year, or first graders, but all of these kinds of lessons that come from the stuff of childhood get left off the curriculum, and that is irritating to me. So, I know I'm out of time, so I just want to end with this idea that learning to be an ethical participant in one's world, a good writer, but also a good collaborator, a good peer, a good participant. We have to think, what do we want to teach young children about writing? How does one be a good and write? When schools, be they traditional or seemingly progressive, teach children that writing is only a set of skills or tools for self-expression, they do not allow for regular sharing times. They misrepresent the nature of writing, which I think is carrying on a conversation with other people. And when they say things like it has to be literally true, they marginalize childhoods themselves. Children, like human beings generally, are searching for relationships and for meaning, and cross-culturally all over the world. Children tell stories, and they use play to dramatize, narrate, and make sense of, and have some control over, and imagine themselves as powerful in what can be a very confusing world. The old days were not perfect days, but we did used to appreciate play and young children. We did used to do that. So our job as teachers is to build on what children do and know. We want them to bring all their resources, their ways with words, their understandings of stories, their imaginations, their social inclinations. Our lessons matter. Our lessons matter, but we have to give children some agency, some space to make their own use of writing. And over time, building on what children do, we can help children name their way of writing, fiction, nonfiction, articulate authorial relations. Sometimes we write with a friend, sometimes we write on our own. We can in these ways provide a formal academic language to help them organize what they are doing. When they write together, children negotiate complex issues of responsiveness, representation, and inclusiveness, of what's fair or good about you, about how you form a textual world. Now, in the end, that's to me what seems worthy of our educational efforts, to support child communicators who, in increasingly disciplined but still imaginative ways, feel obligated to slip words through potential fences to others with whom they are making a world. Sorry, I took so long. Thank you so much for listening. You were very good.